Call on Patrick Harvie to close the Greens, please. 7 minutes, Mr Harvie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, at some levels, this has been a fairly simple debate with some fairly simple questions. Should Article 50 be invoked? Well, last week we saw the sight of MPs openly admitting that they were voting against the interests of their own constituents, and I can understand why some of them representing areas which voted leave might have felt conflicted. But this Parliament is not in that position, and we can in good conscience vote in favour both of the wishes and the interests of our constituents. Should Article 50 be invoked? Now, with no clarity about transitional arrangements from the UK Government, no conditions attached, essentially a blank cheque, and no consensus on Scotland's future. And should this Parliament's view be given respect, be given a formal role? Leaving the EU very clearly involves a change in the powers of this Parliament. And I find it hard to understand the view that formal legislative consent should not be a requirement, at least in terms of the Convention, even if the statutory footing promised in late 2014 has been shown up as the sham we always thought that it was. But there are deeper aspects of this debate as well, and the context in which we have it. We see the rise of deeply troubling far-right politics on both sides of the Atlantic. From Trump in the US to Le Pen in France, there are dangerous forces gathering. Forces against which Europeans and Americans stood together in the middle of the last century, and forces which we must oppose again in this century. Forces which make it abundantly clear that they have gained momentum and inspiration from the narrow, short-sighted, xenophobic and anti-intellectual nature of the Brexit campaign. Forces which are increasingly explicit in seeking the destruction of the European Union itself. We must stand in opposition to those forces. The Greens very clearly will be supporting the government motion tonight. The UK government is very clearly taking a narrow majority in the referendum as a mandate for the most extreme action possible, despite even prominent Leave campaigners explicitly promising that there was no threat to our place in the single market. As for the Conservative amendment, in moving it, John Lamont, who at times achieved a fair approximation of actual anger, told us that we should reject the politics of grievance and division. I thought that the politics of grievance and division was the whole point of the Brexit campaign. The Greens must clearly oppose the Conservative amendment. Even aside from the principle of Article 50, Mr Lamont is asking us to agree that the JMC is an effective way for Scotland to be heard. Well, if the effect that they seek is to neutralise Scotland's view, ignoring our interests and overriding our votes, then yes, it seems pretty effective so far. If he thinks that's unfair, then perhaps he'll join the rest of us in condemning the snub from UK ministers David Davis and Liam Fox, who refused to engage properly with this Parliament's Europe Committee. Mr Lamont tells us as well that the test of a Democrat is to accept a result we don't like. In reality, he's demanding so much more than that. To leave the single market without a shred of a mandate, to use EU citizens as bargaining chips, and to leave the future of devolution to this Parliament at the whim of Tory ministers that this country never voted for. As for the Labour amendment, it reminds us, indeed, that Scotland voted to remain part of the EU and the UK. Indeed, in 2014, a 55% majority to stay in the UK, after hearing explicitly that independence was the threat to our place in Europe. And we then voted by 62% to stay in the EU, after hearing promises that even if we lost, we'd stay in the single market. I'm yet to hear a clear proposition from Labour about how that circle can be squared. The Scottish Government, I think, has gone to some lengths to explore the options for specific arrangements for Scotland, probably greater lengths than I would have gone to myself. But it's the UK government which seems utterly disinterested in exploring those options. And even from UK Labour, I detect very little support for such distinctive arrangements. As for the Liberal Democrat amendment, I have to say I can understand the case. I can understand the argument for a second referendum, and I'm pleased at least that they're not opposed in principle to second referendums. But it seems perhaps a stronger case if seen from the perspective of those who represent Leave voting areas, because the Liberal Democrats appear to have no answer to the very simple question, very simple and obvious question: what's to prevent exactly the same outcome arising again, with the votes of people living in Scotland ignored and overridden once again? We could find ourselves once again with no voice and a UK government acting against our interests without a mandate and without any shred of respect. Deputy Presiding Officer, we've heard the voices of several Leave voters as well, and I'm always happy to hear minority views expressed in this Parliament. Of course I am. But I have to say that after the events of the last 8 months, I don't think anyone can claim that things are working out too well for the left case for Leave, such as it ever was. The Green Amendment, Deputy Presiding Officer, is grounded in a respect for the mandate. Scotland voted to stay. I know and I respect the fact that not every Remain voter can be assumed now to be more open to independence. But on that same basis, not every No voter in 2014 can be assumed to be willing to see Scotland ripped from the EU against our will. Even aside from the Brexit result itself, we cannot endorse the UK government plan to invoke Article 50. They have no plan. They have no transitional arrangements. They have no respect for Scotland's position in this debate. They have no prospect of giving clarity in the next 2 years, and we have no confidence in their management of the situation. And so I commend the amendment in the name of Ross Greer.
Thank you very much.